Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Jewish Veg DC Passover 2020 From Plagues Toward Freedom for All conversation. I'm Sarah Newman. I'm the chair of Outreach for Jewish Veg in the greater DC region, and I also write a Jewish vegan food blog called Niche Noosh. Jewish Veg is the Jewish voice of the plant-based movement, the fastest growing social movement in the world. And the organization's vision is a kinder, healthier, more sustainable world. We work across the United States and the world to inspire people to embrace plant-based diets as an expression of the Jewish values of compassion for animals, concern for health, and for the environment. Jewish Veg was established in 1975 and is one of the first plant-based organizations in the United States. And the work of Jewish Veg is to promote and uphold Jewish values that would otherwise be ignored and in some cases intentionally suppressed. The work is sustained by individual members who believe in the mission of the organization, and you can find out more at jewishveg.org. Today, we are talking about Passover, a holiday that is celebrating freedom and liberation. But we are dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic because of human behaviors towards animals. The global demand for animal products not only assures that another pandemic is around the corner, but is also the leading cause of environmental destruction worldwide. The livestock industry contributes more than half of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. And cattle ranching is the leading cause of Amazon deforestation. The vast majority of the world's agricultural land is being wasted on livestock feed and production. And converting this land for plant-based food would produce enough food to feed 10 billion people. So if we want true freedom and to reverse climate change and avoid the next pandemic, our society and our community needs to shift towards a plant-based diet. So the presentation today is going to be interactive, and we definitely want to hear from you and your thoughts and questions. And there's a chat box on the side of the screen where you can write your questions in. So now I'd like to introduce Rabbi Fred, who is a member of the Jewish Veg National Rabbinic Council. He has been a rabbi at Adat Shalom in Bethesda since 1995. He's also the past president of the Washington Board of Rabbis and chair of the Coalition on the Environment and Jewish Life. Rabbi Fred is the father of two, a husband, an avid environmentalist, and devoted to Tikkun Olam. He will guide our discussion today about how to go forward after Pesach with kindness, about how our personal and collective choices can help to build a future free from suffering and free from plague, built on time-honored Jewish values. So I'm going to turn it over, and Rabbi Fred is going to talk, and then we're going to open it up for a Q&A. But at any point you'd like throughout, you can type in questions. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Honored to do this with the likes of Sarah and Michael Griboff and all the wonderful folks of Jewish Veg. To be clear, the larger frame on this Chol HaMoed Pesach, which is also not incidentally Easter Sunday, the larger frame is liberation writ large. And that includes animal liberation, that includes earth liberation and sustainability, but it also includes human liberation. And we're all feeling it very differently this year when we're logging on in our silos, having done Seders on Zoom and whatnot. And the liberation from our four walls is something that we first look forward to. The question is, when we reemerge, will it be back into a status quo that was not sustainable to begin with, or can we learn from this and get ahead? We're not going to focus primarily on questions of animal ethics and the environmental impact of the food industry. This is really a Pesach shiur about the values of Passover and the larger framework of liberation. It builds toward a number of actions that would only be logical as the outgrowth of that kind of study and that kind of commitment. When we say at the Seder, in every generation, B'chol dor v'dor chayav adam lirot et asmo ki'ilu hu yatsa miMitzrayim, that we personally have to see ourselves as if we are part of it. And Hareze Meshubach, this great line that one is praiseworthy if they extend the story of the telling of the Exodus. And so we are doing that, an exodus from unsustainability to sustainability, an exodus from injustice to justice, but also an exodus from our current constraints, which are necessary and holy in the moment. Please don't venture out more than you need to in this COVID era, but we are actually sacrificing towards something sacred. So that's kind of the larger frame. Two parts. First, a little bit of Pesach values, some images to go with each. I'm new at screen share, but here we go. Maybe it was there. Hope you're seeing it. No, with apologies. Hold on a second. No. There we go. All right. So part one, Pesach. Slideshow. There we go. Liberation for all. That's the larger theme. And the question that I'm going to end with and plant at the beginning, and I hope for some robust conversation via the chat box, is how broadly do we define our circles of compassion and concern when we tell this story and when we dig into these values? So eco-Judaism is the larger frame for me. We cannot forget that the COVID crisis is urgent. The climate crisis is vitally important. It is larger yet. What we have learned from COVID is that we can make radical changes in a span of weeks and months in order to bring about greater sustainability, in order to affirm life. We have to do so by listening to the science. It is actually a brilliant full dress rehearsal for what we need to do around climate. There is a debate between the numbers as high as 51%, at the lowest end, 14.5% of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions and equivalents are responsible directly from the livestock sector. So pick a number anywhere in there, whether it's 1/7 or 1/2, even if it's only 1/7, Dayenu. Shabbat is 1/7 of our life, and it's really important. So is this, especially as the place where our individual actions, as well as collective political and corporate action, can leverage some amazing savings. This does not mean we can't organize around clean energy and that we oughtn't be thinking about other land use issues and a range of personal and collective practices, but this is a vital one and an overlooked one. So the larger frame of what Judaism teaches about unity, about the earth being God's and a gift, and we are actually tenants rather than landlords. Environmental justice, the vitally important question of disproportionate impacts on poor, marginal people, people of color, that is only now barely beginning to get the centrality that it needs. The social justice piece as well. So environmental justice in the sense of care for all, and social justice applied environmentally, care for the least among us. Intergenerational, this is obviously something we do for the long haul, just as the Seder is teach your children. Don't waste, bal tashchit, very important notion. Anything that builds extra waste in it is considered less ideal from a Jewish standpoint, even a halachic Jewish legal one, and clearly that has implications for our diets. And again, Shabbat, the idea of limits to growth, that what's most meaningful and powerful is precisely that seventh, those moments of rest and of being at one with those around us. And 8 through 10, the Sierra Club's motto, explore, enjoy, and protect. So those are also part of our Jewish values, and ending again with protection. We have a responsibility. That responsibility is rooted in the notion of interconnectedness, which I would suggest Pesach has a lot to say about. Beautiful example of a text that's applied both to biodiversity, the need to protect the wild animals, but also the larger chains that include concentrated animal farming operations and the need to deeply think about the relationships among all of us, because even the animals we don't like, superfluous flies, fleas, gnats, elsewhere it says snakes, scorpions, and spiders, right? The ones that we even have baked in fear about, we need to acknowledge with the wisdom of the ancestors, they are part of Seder Breshit, the scheme of creation. So with that said, turning to this moment, the late poet Mary Oliver has a beautiful short poem. This is how you live a life. Pay attention, be astonished, tell about it. Pay attention means we have to open our eyes. We have to ask the tough questions. We have to get over the defense mechanisms and really analyze what is our footprint, what are the implications of our actions. Be astonished, which may be, oh my gosh, I didn't know, or it may be actually the spiritual response of awe, or what Abraham Joshua Heschel called radical amazement, and then tell about it. Tell about it in a careful, thoughtful way. Some of us went through early phases in our vegetarian activism where we were rather insufferable and not necessarily great communicators of this. Yale and also George Mason University nearby have wonderful climate communications science that is actually looking at the psychology and the marketing of how do we most effectively message around these values. And I think we can all learn from that about how to tell it. But we can also learn from our tradition, because of course, what is the Haggadah but telling? Literally, to tell about it, lehagid Haggadah. So the key Jewish value that I want to put forward, we can't say enough about it, is dayenu. This notion of sufficiency, the liturgical antidote to human greed. There was a piece 2 decades ago that I came across through the Center for a New American Dream here in Tacoma Park with a word in Swedish that is very similar. I can't get it quite right with the accent, but legume. So there's an American visiting a Swede, and the Swede only owns 2 towels. And he asks, really? Only 2 towels? Coming from an American mindset of this hyperabundance, why do I need more than 2? Det are legume. Enough, but more than enough, exactly the right amount. Dayenu is to celebrate every step along the way. Dayenu is to celebrate even those partial victories, even those moments when simply surviving, as in a COVID era, and simply helping one neighbor or one person in a marginal or disproportionately impacted category, dayenu. That doesn't actually mean we end there. It means that we stop, we take a breath, we smile, we dance, we celebrate, we recharge, and then we keep going. But from a logic of sufficiency question, dayenu actually means there have to be limits, that there's a level of consumption, whether it's towels or hamburgers, that is simply not sustainable, that does not make sense, except by the warped logic of the cultural context that we find ourselves in. This is the beauty of Judaism or any ancient system as a potentially countercultural voice, asking from a place of depth and profundity, not necessarily 100% accuracy, but challenging our assumptions and our norms. So what exactly is enough? I love this. What is legume for chocolate cake, right? More than enough. But what is legume for CO2? Only what Earth can handle, still with limits. And of course, this is a profound Jewish teaching, most famously expressed by Ben Zoma in Pirkei Avot. Ezehu Ashir, how do you define the person who is rich? Is it a threshold of income? Is it a percentile? No. Hasameach bechelko. Whoever is happy or content with their portion, with their lot. If you love what you have, you are effectively rich. You could be in the millions or billions, but if you are consumed by wanting more, you are actually not rich. Dayenu is a key to happiness, a key to spiritual self-sufficiency, as well as to so many social and environmental challenges. So that's the Pesach value that I want to put most firmly on the table, along with the question, would it be really? The early Freedom Haggadot said, Dayenu and Lo Dayenu. This is enough, but no, it's not enough, because we still have all of this important work to do. Thinking as well about other key Pesach values, memory, this idea of putting ourselves in the shoes of those who actually went out, as if mythically it was us. Pedagogy, the question of how do we transmit these core values? What do a next generation grow up with that will motivate them, whether it's towards civil rights involvement or environmental activism, animal rights, etc. And very profoundly, the question of empathy, because we are the inheritors of a tradition that says, look back on this experience when we were the marginalized, oppressed other, the ger, the immigrant group on the margins of society, slaves, but also strangers. Gerim hayitem be'eretz Mitzrayim. You, Israelites, were this kind of stranger in the land of Egypt. Now we find ourselves with relative power, whether in America, Israel, other diaspora communities, and there are all of these others who are marginalized and immigrant and don't have access to the same social capital. What should our response be? And I learned this from Rabbi Shai Held of Hadar, that we could very easily say, okay, I've suffered, I've been a victim, now magia li. This comes to me, I deserve this. And because of that history of victimhood, I can eat all the burgers that I want. I can heat and air condition as many cubic feet of personal dwelling space as I want because of that history that I've overcome. And that is a perfectly reasonable human nature response. But there's a deeper, a Torah-informed response that says, as much as I want to bounce back from that suffering and now just enjoy to the max, I need to be extra sensitive to those who are now going through it. That is where Hayas comes in, with the teaching about the ger, involvement in 70 million refugees and the disproportionate impacts they face, whether it's from climate effects or COVID effects. We need to center the marginal precisely now in this moment. But can we extend that? And in the second half, we're going to get there. The question of kind of a theology approach of liberation, and how do we deepen that sensitivity toward the other? So I'm going to, I believe, stop for a moment here. And if there's a first round of questions or thoughts, I'd love to hear it. And after that, we will continue with part 2. Sarah?
Yeah. So if you have any questions, you can just put them right into the chat. And I just wanted to offer, I really appreciate what you're saying about the Dayenu and how we're applying that to our lives today and our previous experiences in life. To your point, doesn't mean that we can go and eat as many whatever types of food or air condition our houses or things like that. And I think that COVID has really shown us how we can live in a much more simple way. So if anyone has any, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, we can hope and we can work toward that. Yeah. And conversations like this hopefully are a piece of that. And Chag Sameach to you, Ruthie.
So I'm not seeing any questions right now. So I think maybe it's good to continue and then we can have a broader discussion in a few minutes at the end of your presentation. Thank you.
Okay, awesome. So theology. Why theology, you might ask? Are we still screen sharing? I hope, right?
Oh, you have to go back, yeah.
There we go, yep. Here we go, okay. Share. We will all get fluid at this before too long, I promise. So, why theology? No, not from the beginning, sorry. We've been there. Liberation theology. Why take this approach? First, the idea of praxis. that theology, the belief structure, lurks in the background, and it helps inform our actions in ways that we only realize when we actually surface and check our assumptions. So praxis and checking our assumptions are closely related. The idea that there is lived theology, that it actually matters, even for those of us who think of ourselves as modern and empirical and post-theology. Theology is another name, in a sense, for myth, for an organizing structure that explains the universe, in the same way that science is a myth or narrative is a myth. We go with science when it comes to climate, when it comes to COVID, and that could be seen as a challenge to theology, the classic Galileo versus the Pope idea. But actually, science and Judaism go hand in hand. We have long been a pro-empirical tradition. Data is vitally important to the halachic Jewish legal decision-making process, as it is now in this COVID era. So also the powerful depth rooting with our ancestors, so that our beliefs are not only measured in a timeline that goes back to, Rachel Carson, 1962 Silent Spring, or 1970, the first Earth Day. Of course, the big half-century anniversary is coming up just in a week or so. But that we can root it in something ancient and something powerful. Again, not that it's inerrant, but it is ineffable. There is a power that comes from that we need to tap. And to be clear, theology includes room for healthy skepticism. Agnostics who are 99% atheist, but leave open the door, or agnostics who are much more traditional, but also have question marks in their theology. I think most of us, if we're honest, are on that spectrum. So you don't have to be a Bible-thumping Jew or any other Bible, Quran, Bhagavad Gita thumper, etc., in order to appreciate this exploration, I hope. Again, on this Easter Sunday, it's appropriate that liberation theology is going to draw heavily on our encounter with the dominant culture of America and the West, of course, with Christianity, and we're in it with our brothers and sisters now in a way that was not the case before the 20th and 21st century. Mordechai Kaplan, my guy, founder of Reconstructionism, very important 20th century Jewish philosopher, laid this out back in 1937. We are still victims. He's writing this, of course, in the early years of the Nazi era. But Jews have entered into such intimate relationship with the life of the world about them that we can no longer envisage our own deliverance except as a phase of general human deliverance. 80 years ago, he couldn't imagine of saying just general deliverance. This is a theme that we're going to see in the development of liberation theology. But the notion, intimate relationship with the life of the world about them, calls us to specific account with both marginal people and marginal species, with both the individual acts and the systems that we are a part of. It also implies the transformation of human nature and social institutions through the divine power of intelligence and goodwill. We are applying what is godly, but we're doing it ourselves. This is that sort of room for agnostic. He was a religious naturalist, not believing in an interventionist God who's going to hear our prayer or who chooses one people over another, but rather God as the sum total of the animating forces of the universe, that long moral arc that bends toward justice, as Theodore Parker and Dr. King taught. In the Torah, the story of the Exodus means that to help the oppressed is an essential attribute of godhood. If we are serious about taking action that is rooted in our sacred stories, to help the oppressed is a key direction, both for God and for us. My teacher and many of ours, Rabbi Arthur Waskow, who lived here in the DC area 50 years ago, 52, at Pesach, Dr. King's assassination sparked riots. He was in the streets trying to help get food and medicine into the impoverished communities of color, and looked around and saw the tanks and jeeps everywhere and realized this is Pharaoh's army. And as he was going to his once-a-year Jewish event of family Seder, he knew the stories, was a secular Jew, began to click and said, oh, this is real. The pharaonic instinct is within all of us, and this is an incredibly powerful myth, an incredibly powerful story that helps organize our values and drive our actions. The next year, he wrote the Freedom Haggadah, which led to feminist Haggadot and many other sort of liberatory approaches, including Roberta Kalachowski, the first, I believe, back in the 80s, specifically vegetarian Haggadah for the liberated lamb. She worked with another teacher of many of ours, Richard Schwartz, who's now in Jerusalem, but was a leading Jewish vegetarian activist out of New York for many years, and environmental and human rights activist as well. You really oughtn't separate and can't separate them. And working together, they helped to resurface some of the teachings that many of us already know, like the inclusion of a beet on the Seder plate. Some say a mushroom, right? Something that evokes the Paschal sacrifice, either because of the color, the blood red of the beet when it's cut, or the texture, the somewhat dry, meaty, as it were, mushroom. Those are just some of the teachings that came to us from there. That work, of course, has been updated through jewishveg.org, veganpassover.org, now a beautiful color edition. Get yours now and start reading it. You still have 350 days till the next Seder. 3, all theology is metaphorical. This is my teacher and colleague, RRC classmate, Rabbi Tova Spitzer in Boston, who's working on a book to this effect, building on Judith Plaskow's important insight from her 1990 key Jewish feminist work, Standing Again at Sinai. Criticism of received images of God is not, of course, criticism of God. We can criticize these metaphors we've inherited all we want, because that is trying to name the ineffable and the transhuman through the very mortal and finite lenses that we bring. So it's only criticism of ways of speaking about a reality that ultimately is unknowable. So we inherited Old Man in the Sky. We inherited, I call it Santa Claus theology, right? He advisedly knows when you've been sleeping, knows when you're awake, knows if you've been bad or good, right? And this schar va'onesh traditional theology that's already being questioned in the Bible. That's key in the Deuteronomic impulse, but there are other places in the Torah that question that, and that we already have. The rabbis in the Talmud begin to undo it in all kinds of creative ways, because they realize it's not as simple as you do right and you're rewarded, and you're punished. So many of those received images are up for re-examination and have been for at least 2,000 years. Avinu Malkeinu, God is our Father and our King, problematic potentially from a gender standpoint, but also from a hierarchy standpoint. So what if God is friend? That's also an authentic metaphor. What if instead of father, God is mother? That too is authentic. Shaddai, of course, my breast, and God as nurturer. A personal favorite of both Rabbi Toba's and mine is water. The prophet Jeremiah calls God Makor Mayim Chaim, the source of the living waters, the source of the waters of life. An image like that may just point us in the direction of protection of water as a theological imperative, conservation of water as a Jewish value, which indeed I believe that it is. That is authentic from a place of tradition, as well as from an analysis of the world around us, when so much water is wasted, when so much unnecessary pollution is happening, and a lot of it, of course, is connected to livestock and the meat industry, just as also a lot of it is connected to our energy use, our land use, etc. Other images from our tradition, God as rock, as makom, place. The idea of God being, when you're rooted in place, you're rooted in God, very powerful. The voice, the fire, the cloud. These are all metaphors that we can use as well, including God as liberator, and even God as lover. Early eco-feminist theologian Sally McFaig back in 1987 had this image of God as lover, not focused on individuals, but on salvation, on making whole the entire beloved cosmos that has become estranged and fragmented, sickened by unhealthy practices, threatened by death and extinction. That describes COVID. That also describes climate. All species of flora and fauna will be valuable when we think of God as lover. And the entire evolutionary complex, intricate as it is, infinitely precious and wondrous. What do we do about that estrangement? How can we reduce that cognitive dissonance that has emerged because we have not focused sufficiently on this aspect of God, which is, again, authentic from our tradition and centered in so many ways at Pesach? And might asking these theological questions help? When we say liberation theology, we typically look to Gustavo Gutierrez, Peruvian priest starting in 67 and 68, built on throughout Latin America, this incredible notion of putting liberation at the absolute center of the religious and theological enterprise. It is committed to abolishing the present situation of injustice and constructing a new society that includes active and efficacious participation in the struggle that the exploited have taken on against their oppressors. Again, on its own terms, born particularly of the unique challenges of a post-colonial Central and South America, no surprise, it's focused on human patterns of exploitation and the remediation thereof. But you cannot separate that from the environmental context, which contemporary liberation theologians all begin to understand. So early efforts in Jewish liberation theology, again, referencing some of the early work from our Christian friends, that in the Exodus story itself, this is actually after the golden calf in chapter 32, God is transcendent as God the liberator, not a God who consoles the oppressed to accept their condition as oppressed. Do not venerate God as consoler. That's idolatry. And also the idea that tradition has to fight the very natural tendency of religion to become opiate for the masses and to lose its power as a motivator toward solidarity. Religion should motivate solidarity. These are just some of the steps along the way. Again, Sally McFaig reminding us that we have to go beyond human beings to the destiny of the cosmos, that we need the fulfillment of all humanity in the political and social realities, and now we have to deprivatize it, take it another step further or broader to include the well-being of all life. The well-being of all life includes the flora and fauna driven to extinction by our land use patterns and by our greenhouse gas emissions. It also includes the cattle and livestock who are themselves part of that process of devastation, and also sentient beings with their own inner narrative and their own place in the Seder Breshit. Animal liberation and human liberation. Can we even keep the two separate? Problematic witness, I would say, borne by the most controversial and most important voice in this field, Peter Singer. Many of the things that he has said, particularly when seen through a disability rights lens, which is another very important vector of empowerment, are actually rather less than ethical. But he is the lead voice. He wrote the book on animal liberation in 1975 called Animal Liberation. And it's still worth grappling with, but with that asterisk. We have to bring non-human animals within our sphere of moral concern. We have to be concerned for the work of the cosmos. There's a wonderful recent book by Rabbi David Seidenberg called Kabbalah and Ecology that is entirely focused on this with some very deep Torah. I highly recommend it. And we have to stop treating the lives of our non-human sentient cousins on the evolutionary tree as expendable for whatever trivial purposes we may have. We can debate what is a trivial purpose, and we can debate on what rare occasions might it be necessary to take actions that expend animal life in the name of human life. There is, of course, a deep ecology theory that is beautiful and valid and maybe a little less than fully rooted in the Jewish tradition that says, a bug is a tree, is a frog is a human, and that we are all precisely equal. We can admit some hierarchy while also agreeing that the current hierarchy is completely out of whack with standards of Torah, of sustainability, or of justice. So we don't need to be distracted by the theoretical debates about how far is too far. We can all agree that where we are is a mismatch for where we should be. Speciesism is wrong, or at least the crazy amount of speciesism that we practice, where we just center the Homo sapien experience and think very little about the rest, when in fact, an enlightened self-interest just for the survival and thriving of our Homo sapiens, including our own descendants, actually relies on the integrity of that larger creation. He wonders aloud, it's fine if vegetarians are in it for another reason, like climate change, but when non-vegetarians, the humans' problems come first, I gotta wonder, what is it that they're doing for human beings that compels them to continue to support the wasteful, ruthless exploitation of farm animals? Not every issue has to be front and center for each of us, and it will help those of us in the vegetarian and vegan activist and educator community to remember that this doesn't have to be the number one burning issue for everyone, but just as we all have to think about disability rights, we all have to think about social justice, racial rapprochement and racial justice has to be near the center of every discourse that is authentic, given the reality of 2020, even the disproportionate impact of COVID on communities of color right here in the States. The same goes, of course, for these questions. You cannot ignore what's on your plate and how it got there, and the carbon footprint, as well as the suffering footprint of that. And that is something that we need to find the right language to help those who aren't quite there yet to see this as one of those issues that they have to be cognizant of. We all have to. By ceasing to rear and kill animals for food, very much in Sarah Newman, who's herself a wonderful educator and activist in this field, please read her blog. As she said, by ceasing to rear and kill animals for food, we can make so much extra food available for humans that if properly distributed, it would eliminate starvation and malnutrition. Animal liberation is human liberation too. This we must learn. Homestretch. Theology of interconnection and care. One of my absolute heroes is a liberal Christian poet farmer in his 80s in Kentucky, Wendell Berry. Everything he writes is worth sitting with. It's just incredibly profound. We cannot exempt from our care anything at all that we have the power to damage. Right? Which goes back to Aldo Leopold in 1949, the Sand County Almanac, that love your neighbor actually means, or do unto those who live downstream of you as you would wish those who live upstream to do. We are all in these cycles. We are all upstream and we are all downstream. So if we are connected and if we have the power to damage, it has to be within our care. And that now means everything in the world. And this realization, heavy as it is, means that we have reclaimed and revalidated the ground of our moral and religious tradition. This is authentic from our sources. What we have traditionally called sins are wrong, not because they are forbidden, he writes, but because they divide us from our neighbors, from the world, and from God. Sins deny care. The opposite of sin, whether you frame that as mitzvah, good deed, or mitzvah, commandment, is the imperative of care, rooted in interconnection. So here's the question for the chat that I hope is about to ensue. When we surface these assumptions, and when we really examine our actions, who or what are we unintentionally exempting from our care? How can we take it further, as effectively, as nuanced, as Torah-informed as we can? And the broader frame for this is, with the cosmic background here to inspire it, to think bigger. The Haggadah is primarily the story of liberation for one people. It opens the door for the possibility of liberation for all people, which in turn opens the next door, the one we must walk through, of liberation for all. Awe, restraint, humility, all key Jewish values, all with a Passover lens, because Pesach equals hope. And again, for our Christian friends and those of us in multi-faith families and households, this is, of course, Easter Sunday, the day of resurrection, the primary Western holiday of the same theme of hope, a beautiful overlap on this sacred Sunday of Chol HaMoed Pesach. The door of hope is still open, Michael Walzer wrote in 1985, and reprinted in our 1994 Reconstructionist Siddur, where I first came across it. Things are not what they might be, even though what they might be isn't totally different from what they are. We still believe what the Exodus first taught. 1, wherever you live, it is probably Egypt. 2, there is a better place, a world more attractive, a promised land. And 3, the way to the land is through the wilderness. There is no way to get from here to there except by joining together and marching. Eager to have a conversation. Hope that this Torah has been useful, and looking forward to nuancing it now or down the line.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Fred. So please type your questions into the chat. And I see one here first from, I think there might be.
Man. Hello.
Matthew, who's asking, he wants to hear more about the earlier reference to climate change communication and balancing the urgency of climate change and COVID. Where can we responsibly say Dayenu regarding approachable messaging?
Excellent. So again, I recommend the YPCCC Yale program on climate change communications, and right across the river, George Mason University also is a national leader in this field. And if you just Google climate communication, I recommend it. And I do think that because vegetarian and vegan activists have gotten a bum rap sometimes for what is interpreted as zealotry, and sometimes is, but is also just an insufficient recognition of the defense mechanisms, the way that people take in information that is a challenge to their assumptions and their embedded worldview, their theology, as it were, and they seek confirmation bias. As Einstein wrote, it is the theory which decides what we observe. So if it doesn't fit your theory, if it doesn't fit your box, then you're going to have a tendency to discount it unless you find the right way in. And many climate activists, just as many vegetarian and vegan activists, and as we're learning, the two really need to be one, aren't always quite as nuanced. The COVID era begins with a recognition, right? All communication is less about what I want to tell you and more about what you are going to receive from this encounter, from this communication. So if you are broken because of COVID, because we are all vulnerable, even if you are an affluent, white, upper middle class, you have a white collar profession, you're still drawing a salary, you're one of the lucky ones, you still know people who are suffering. You still have four-wall syndrome. And if we don't start there, we miss something. Even in a post-COVID era, the same will apply. So effective messaging always has to begin with that extra effort to focus on where the other is. Martin Buber in 1923 wrote the famous I and Thou, which is really about this, about the ethics and theology of relationship, and that very often we treat others in an instrumental way. Our own kids, when we're focused on getting them, out the door for school, back when that was a thing, right? In that moment, the child who you love more than anyone in the universe is still an it, right? It isn't, they are an object, and your goal is purely instrumental. Get them out, right? Whereas the idea of thou, which according to Buber, you can have with a cat and even a tree and a rock, as well as with another human being. He writes all this 197 years ago, that when there is both will and grace, the it becomes thou. And when we are in a real I-thou moment, when we are able to have that deep empathy, that is one of the key Pesach values as well, then that includes empathy for where people are in the moment and how vitally important to be able to message in a way that others can hear because they hear your care. If we start with care and we start with that sensitivity, we will go much further. And Jeffrey Spitz-Cohen of Jewish Veg, focusing on where the other is also applies to vegan advocacy, absolutely, which is the whole point. And we have a lot to learn from the experts like the Yale and George Mason folks, but also from each other as to what makes the most effective messaging.
Thank you. I have another question for you. You were back to Dayenu, and can you offer some specific steps that people can take right now to bring more Dayenu into their lives?
Nice. So much of this is the classic Jewish teaching of cultivating gratitude, right? The second to last stanza of the Amidah that traditionally Jews say 21 times a week, 3 times a day, is Modim. We are grateful. Modim anachnu lach. We're grateful to you, God, God of our ancestors, who works miracles and wonders on a daily basis. Shebachol eit erev v'voker v'tzaharayim. These wondrousnesses and goodnesses are with us at every moment, evening, morning, and afternoon. And if we can channel that, the beautiful notion Rabbi Meir in the Talmud says that we should be saying 100 blessings every day. If you do the math, 16 waking hours, that's pretty close to every 10 minutes of your life on average, a blessing. If we can let ourselves stew in the place of our own limitation and pain for up to 9 minutes, and then remember that Jewish teaching from Rabbi Meir in the Talmud, it's time for a blessing. It's time for a moment of appreciation. Then we develop the kind of dayenu that leads to the sense of sufficiency that will ultimately lead to sustainability. So again, the prescription for personal happiness is also the prescription for social and environmental tikkun or repair. It is start with gratitude and appreciation, and from there, an ethic of care, protection, all rooted in interconnection.
Thank you. I was wondering if you could talk about some of the things that you do in your synagogue in terms of living these actual values, both physically, and there's so much amazing programming happening. Maybe you could just share some of the things that you're doing.
I appreciate that. So Adat Shalom in Bethesda is known as a particularly green congregation among many others, blessedly, and we're through networks like Interfaith Power and Light. I cannot recommend strongly enough joining together because the work that we have to do, whether it's installing solar panels or figuring out affordable fair trade organic coffee, right, and vegetarian and vegan bulk ordering that might be kosher or halal, we're in it together with every masjid, every church, every gurdwara in the community. Interfaith Power and Light, among many other great resources, is a place for that. So in that, as part of that network, we have planted our own organic garden, which is less than fully tended right now, but we've also encouraged a lot of victory gardens among our members. So a lot of backyards now have cuttings from the synagogue Mishnah garden, we call it. We've also created a Shemitah grove inspired by the very powerful teachings of Shemitah, the 7th year, as a place where social and environmental and spiritual all meet. And that includes perennials. So the power of fruit trees is just an example, as well as rewilding some of the area that had been grass into what we call sacred grounds, which is native habitat for the local pollinators. We also have a full Oneg Shabbat when we are in session, which we will be again any month or season now. Every single week through a rotating co-op, 50 servings of vegetarian food is twice a year, and setup and cleanup is a responsibility of membership. And that model helps create a milchik. It is not vegan, and it does include fish, but on a limited basis with labeling. But our dishes, the communal dishes that we wash rather than using disposables, for all the obvious reasons, have never seen anything with more of a carbon footprint and more sentience than the occasional tuna or salmon. It is mostly either vegan or lacto-ovo. And there's compromises all along, and that includes the compromise of kashrut, that it is kosher by ingredients as an effect, but not strictly, because it's not under hashgacha. We want people to be able to bring their own food. Compromises are part of how we live in the community, and we are still lowering the full carbon footprint of 200 or so average diners for Shabbat lunch, because of the collective standard. Along with, of course, an EPA Energy Star building that has all kinds of passive and active solar and things like that. All of those are part of what it means to be enlightened stewards and what it means really to be practitioners of faith in the 21st century. We can learn a lot with and from each other. If I or Adat Shalom can be resources, feel free to follow up afterwards, adatshalom.net.
Great. Really impressive. I've been there, and it is really, and it's also a beautiful building and setting, and it's really wonderful what you're doing there. And, as a leader in the Jewish community, both here in DC and nationwide, in terms of your work with Jewish Veg and Kosel and so many other groups, I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more in terms of how post-COVID we can continue on this momentum of building more Jewish solidarity on these issues. I think what's happened in COVID, some of the beautiful things is this cross engagement of people across religions and countries and so forth that has been, I've personally found very inspiring. And how can we take that after COVID when we go back into hopefully not as much of a siloed world that we were living in? So I'm just wondering if you could speak about that in terms of the Jewish world and applying all the things that you've been teaching, and then also perhaps on an interfaith scale.
Amen. Thank you. So there's all this painful prognostication that the economic bounce that the markets are hoping for, right, when this is over, is going to return oil consumption to historic levels, is going to return meat processing plants to their fullest capability. And it assumes that we just go back to a status quo that was never sustainable. There is a counter narrative that we need to begin to think about now in the COVID era. Apropos of Matt's question of messaging starting with where people are, which is the reality of the limitations of this era, and then noting what will a more holy and a more ethical and a more communal perspective look like. People have been willing to make sacrifices. The typically thought of as boring Torah portions of Vayikra and Sav that are all about sacrifices were the first ones of this quarantine era. And in fact, sacrifice is etymologically from sacred. It's not primarily about giving up. Even the baseball analogy, right? A sacrificed fly is a good thing because someone on your team comes home, though you personally are out. If we have that team model, which is what the ancients taught, sacrifice from sacred. The Hebrew is korban from karov, which means close or dear, near. So it is actually a nearness offering. Yes, that ram or even those turtle doves are a measurable piece of my annual household income. But in the old model, I would go to the priest in Jerusalem and I would get expiation for my sins. I would get connection with God. And in many of the cases, I would get feeding the public servants and the poor, all from that moment of giving up. That is like when I write a $36 donation to an NGO that's doing important work. Thank God I'm in the position to be able to do that and multiples, but I feel good about it. There's altruism, but there's also just enlightened self-interest. Sacrifice at its best is to be conscious of not so much what we're giving up, though that's real, but conscious of what we gain and those we love gain. And so when we frame it that way, changing our thermostat settings, rethinking our cars, rethinking our energy sources, rethinking even where we live and how we live, and centrally, not only for this conversation, but really for all of us, what we eat, when we eat it, how we eat it, where it's sourced from, its cradle-to-grave impact. It's tough to ask those questions. There's this wonderful parallel between the Yiddish expression "zu schwer sein a Yid," it's tough to be a Jew, and Kermit the Frog's lament, "It ain't easy being green," right? They are so parallel because the Jewish and the green impulses are both to ask tough nudnik questions. It would be so much easier just to order off the menu, but I have to think about kashrut, I have to think about ethics, I have to think about human footprint, eco footprint, I have to think about the communal implications of who I'm eating and where I'm eating. It's not easy, but it's worth it. And we need that consciousness to suffuse. And this era of closure is a great opportunity because people are in so many ways rolling up their sleeves for their neighbors, taking one for the collective team by limiting their own mobility and their own short-term happiness for the sake of a collective long-term gain. And that same logic will drive us toward the needed changes in every aspect of our lives to return us to a path of sustainability and justice, which is a lower carbon future, a lower methane future, and a much more plant-based diet future. And we cannot have one without the other.
Great. Thank you so much. So we're almost at the top of the hour. And so I just wanted to remind everyone, in the chat box, you can see the presentation. There's a link to the presentation. And to go to the Jewish Veg website, jewishveg.org, for lots of resources and to sign up for the newsletter and to get involved with everything that we're doing here in DC. We're doing, as you can tell, still online events while we can't meet in person. But so much is happening with the DC chapter. So I really encourage people locally to get involved, but nationwide, there's a lot. And also to visit Rabbi Fred in person or online at Adat Shalom. So thank you to everyone who has come today, and wishing you all continued good holiday and to be safe and well in this very challenging time.
Amen, Stella. Health and sustainability for all.
Yes.
And Moedim L'Simcha. Enjoy the rest of Pesach.
Thank you, everyone.